Hey, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I am okay. I am okay. I'm going to get my measles shot tomorrow
Good.
just to be on the safe side. And I mean, I got them when I was a baby. I don't know what the side effects are for adults. So I'm kind of like going to see if I'm working on Monday. Anyway, well, welcome to Goodnight, Mr. Holmes, a podcast about the Granada Sherlock Holmes, which ran on ITV in the UK between 1984 and 1994, and ran on Masterpiece Mystery in the US around the same time. I'm Laura.
And I'm Rachel.
And today we are looking at episode 10 in the series, which is called The Norwood Builder.
The story was first published in the Strand magazine in 1903.
Cool. All right. Okay. There are signs that it's taking place at the beginning of the 20th century throughout all of this. It's a more detailed and complicated story. I had totally forgotten about it.
Yeah, it came back to me as I was watching it.
For me, it was like I've seen these. I've watched these series over and over and over again. I don't know why. Like this is like buried down in the memory hole somewhere. But we open on a sort of Mrs. Danvers-like woman peering out a window at a huge fire. And within the fire, there's a human skull. So someone has died in the conflagration. And the fire brigade comes, and a man tries to get to the fire, but he's held back by the fire crew.
Was that Lestrade?
Okay. Yes, and that brings me to we're going to pronounce it Lestrade
because everybody outside of the series pronounces it Lestrade.
Yes. Okay. One of the brigade knocks with the woman who's been at the window at a door and goes inside, and they're searching around the room, and the woman finds a walking stick that has like blood stains at the top. And the brigade and Lestrade come across the skeleton in the fire. So it's an ugly scene. And then we're in some kind of shop with Holmes and Watson while Watson is paying, and Holmes is complaining there's no good crime in London anymore.
And Watson's like, yeah, we've heard this before.
Yes. And he also says there's not many people in London would agree.
Well, one mustn't be selfish.
Exactly. And he calls himself an out-of-work specialist whose occupation has gone. I mean, he's gone like what, for like 3 days without a case?
Yeah, tell it to the blacksmiths in a couple of decades, Holmes.
Right. So they walk along the street talking about Holmes's recent cases. Watson's trying to cheer him up. And
like, look at all of these important cases that you did. And Holmes is like, yeah, but that was then, and this is now.
Right. And there's a lot of building and scaffolding on the street, and a truck rolls by. So we're starting to see motors on the road. It's not horse driven, it's like steam driven or something. And it's just a ton of commotion and confusion. And anybody who has ever lived in a city with construction going on outside your house, that's the scene.
Yes, I remember those days.
Yeah, it happens to me all the time. They no sooner pave the street than they have to go in and dig up a pipe somewhere. So at 22 Winby, amidst all the hubbub on the street, Mrs. Hudson is protesting to a visitor that Holmes is not at home.
And he's just not hearing it. He's like, I have to see him. And Mrs. Hudson's like, okay, but he's not here. I have to see him.
But they catch sight of Holmes coming home, and he says, I must see you. And he calls himself the unhappy John Hector McFarlane. Like they're supposed to know who that is. And Holmes gestures for him to come inside with them. And once inside, he instructs McFarlane, who is sweating, to tell them very slowly and quietly who he is and what he wants. It's like basically calm the fuck down.
Yeah.
And he says McFarlane's name doesn't mean anything, but he can deduce that McFarlane's a bachelor, a solicitor, a Freemason, and an asthmatic.
But aside from that, I don't know anything about you at all.
Yes.
And
Um,
then Watson, without blinking, just goes over the clues like it's because of this and this, and you're breathing hard. And
yeah, the untidy clothes, that means that there's not a woman taking care of him, which is not strictly true, as we find out. The sheaf of papers with the red ribbon around it says he's a solicitor because that's how they grouped their papers before file folders were invented. There's a Freemason token on his watch chain, and yeah, he's breathing heavily. And McFarlane says he is the most unhappy man in all of London. And he directs them to a story in the newspaper, which they have not read yet, so it's morning. A timber yard has caught fire at the back of a house belonging to a builder named Jonas Oldacre.
yeah, Watson pronounces it as Jonas, which
Yes,
is appropriate.
do that to the guy. I mean, and it's Oldacre lives in Lower Norwood. So Norwood's in the south of London, near Brixton, which is to the north, and the Crystal Palace Football Club is to the south. So we would consider it suburban today, but back then it was relatively undeveloped, and a timber yard would not have been surprising there. Brixton is where A Study in Scarlet takes place.
Yeah.
So, you know, they kind of know the area, but not really. Anyway, Oldacre seems to have disappeared. Watson reads out from the newspaper, an examination of his room revealed a safe which was open, signs of a murderous struggle, and a heavy walking stick with stains of blood upon the handle. At which point, McFarlane stands up and says, "All I ask is you don't abandon me. A man has followed me from London Bridge Station. If they arrest me before I finish my story, make them give me time to tell Holmes the truth."
I could go to jail happy if I knew you were outside working for me, which is the kind of flattery that
Yes,
you employ if you want Holmes to work for you.
it works. Arrest you. This is really most gratifying. I mean, he's all smiles.
Yeah.
And he asks what charge McFarlane expects to be arrested on. And McFarlane says of murdering Mr. Jonas Oldacre of Lower Norwood. Watson continues reading out from the paper. Sensational developments have been reported. Charred remains have been found among the ashes of the fire, and the police's theory is that a victim was clubbed to death and the body ignited. It is known that Mr. Oldacre received a visitor last night, and the stick has been identified as belonging to that person, a young London solicitor by the name of John Hector McFarlane. And Holmes, of
It's a
course,
great name.
wants to know why hasn't he been arrested yet? I mean, this is one of those episodes where like every question leads to a little story instead of an answer.
Yeah.
So McFarlane says he lives with his mother in Blackheath, which is to the northwest of Norwood. It's about a 30-minute drive today, and probably, you know, a similar carriage ride. They're about 7 miles apart. And, you know, so like today it's 30 minutes because traffic.
Mhm.
Back then it would have been like a 30-minute carriage ride because distance. And carriages just went slowly.
Yeah. It's also a rallying point for the peasants' revolt, right? 1381, according to Wikipedia.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So McFarlane says he had late business with Oldacre, so he stayed at a hotel in Norwood, which is just, you know, it's Conan Doyle being stupid again because they're just not that far apart. And he says he knew nothing of any of this till he was on the train to the office that morning and read about it in the paper. And
It won't be the first instance in the story of Conan Doyle being stupid.
right. So he immediately goes to 221B. And here come the cops. And Holmes is just so happy. He smiles at Lestrade.
Yeah, Lestrade is described in A Study in Scarlet as rat-faced, and the actor sort of punches himself in, like
Yes.
he's trying to give himself a kind of scurrying rat-like appearance.
Mhm.
I could be wrong, but I don't think he does that in later episodes. Which
Okay.
makes sense because, you know, when you first meet him, you want to, you know, evoke the canon. And, you know, then once people are used to you, you can
Do what you want.
exactly.
Holmes says, "We've been expecting you." And Lestrade starts to arrest McFarlane. But Holmes interrupts him and asks him to let McFarlane finish his story. And they go back and forth a bit,
Mhm.
with McFarlane pleading. So basically, it's 2 against 1. They're ganging up on Lestrade. And
But
Holmes,
Lestrade by the way, was Holmes in A Study in Scarlet described him and Gregson, whom I think we met last week, as the pick of a bad lot. So he's
Right.
not a fan of the police, but he acknowledges that Lestrade and Gregson are people you can trust.
Yeah, they have some effectiveness to them. So Lestrade gives them half an hour, and Holmes starts to gesture the police out of the apartment, but Lestrade sits down. And the cop at the door
and takes out his notebook.
Yes, the cop at the door steps in front of Holmes and closes the door, and Holmes is like, he's peeved. So Holmes sits down with McFarlane and basically gives the Miranda warning because the police are in the room.
Because what you say can be used in evidence against you.
Yes.
Right to remain silent.
And McFarlane says he didn't know Oldacre. His parents did, but they quote unquote drifted apart. So he was surprised when Oldacre appeared at his office the previous afternoon. And we see Oldacre carrying that same sheaf of papers tied with the red ribbon. And McFarlane asks him to sit down, and he doesn't. He gives McFarlane the papers and a note and says that's the draft to his will, and he needs it done up in legalese. And then he sits down and says, I'll sit here while you do that, which no pressure. The office, by the way, I fell in love with the solicitor's office.
Yeah.
You know, it just all this wood, the cabinetry, the file, the file. What do you call it?
It was very open plan.
Yeah, it was.
He wasn't the only person working in that office. And I don't know that I'd want other people working to hear what I'm saying to the solicitor.
I completely agree. Lawyers should have their own offices or find a conference room, but I guess they didn't have those back then. So McFarlane is astonished to see the entire estate has been left to him. But Oldacre tells him he's a bachelor, he's got only a few relatives, and he doesn't like them. He's essentially retired, but he was a successful builder. Many years ago, he was in love with McFarlane's mother, but she was in love with McFarlane's father. 3 months ago, McFarlane's father died, and Oldacre calls McFarlane the son that might very well have been my own.
So mine turned to the mother. I hear you're single now.
Yes. So he's sentimental.
Mm-hmm. And of course, McFarlane says, wow, thanks so much, but this is we have to have somebody else draw up the will if I'm going to be your inheritor, because this is a very clear conflict of interest here.
Yeah, none of that happened.
And the story ends.
No, so Oldacre says, this is my way of securing your future. Whatever I leave will be in worthy hands. And then Oldacre decides to leave. So much for him sitting there until McFarlane's done it. McFarlane then is supposed to come to his house that night with the finished will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the first red flag is Oldacre knew his mother and hoped to marry her, but then she met and married his father. All right, that's red flag number one. Red flag number two is right here. As Oldacre is leaving, he tells McFarlane not to tell his mother because he wants it to be a surprise.
Exactly. So McFarlane doesn't know the Norwood area, and so he's half hour late arriving to the house. And he's ushered in by the housekeeper, who, and I love this so much, is played by Rosalie Crutchley, who played Mrs. Dudley in The Haunting in 1963.
Oh, no way.
Yes way.
Oh, that's awesome. She's a perfect Mrs. Dudley.
Yes. Yes. And the whole Mrs. Danvers.
Yes.
I mean, it's just, she's been in
Mrs. Danvers throughout my notes.
She's been in a lot of British movies and TV shows, and she's always playing this formidable, forbidding sort of character. So she's who you call in when you want this. She has a slight resemblance to the actress who played the Wicked Witch of the West in Wizard of Oz.
Yeah, I can see that.
Kind of like skinny face, and like glaring eyes.
Yeah.
And McFarlane says it was not the warmest of receptions, and the house had a peculiar, unloved feeling.
Red flag number 3.
So he's shown into Oldacre's bedroom, where the guy keeps a very large safe. And McFarlane, as instructed, takes the papers out of the safe, adds them to the pile he's already carrying, and goes to a desk. At this point, I don't know if the desk is in the bedroom or in a separate room. It's unclear.
Yeah, he talks about the bedroom being on the ground floor, but you never see a bed.
Right.
It just looks like an office. So I don't know what they were talking
weird.
about.
Yeah. So he finalizes the will with sealing wax and presses his thumb into the seal as the wax hardens. And he leans back as an owl is hooting, and the night, you can tell the night is late. And, once he's done that, he's hustled out. He can't find his walking stick. Oldacre says he'll take care of it and return it to him in the future because they're going to be seeing a lot of each other.
Red flag number 4.
McFarlane tells Holmes that that's how he left. Oldacre, the safe was open, the documents were on the desk, and meanwhile, as he said, he spent the night at a hotel and was ignorant of everything until he read about it in the paper. And Holmes asks for the original draft of the will and asks Lestrade if he can keep it for 24 hours. And Lestrade says, if it would amuse you, anything else you would like? And it is like sarcastic. And Holmes says, not until I've been to Blackheath. Lestrade says, you mean Norwood? And Holmes says, no doubt, that is what I must have meant.
And Lestrade doesn't go, oh, no. I should pay attention to that. He's just like, yeah, Norwood, cool, bye.
And they take McFarlane off in the paddy wagon, and along with the sheaf of documents, and Holmes is reviewing the draft of the will as they leave. And then he kind of snuggles up to Watson with the will. It was so weird. So, like, he's scooting in on the couch, and he says, "There's
an arm on the back of the couch too, right?"
Yeah, like he's snuggling.
Yeah.
There are certain points about this document, are there not?
And Watson says, "Yeah, it's illegible."
Yes, he says he can read a few lines, but most of them are in terrible handwriting, and he can't decipher it. Holmes asks what he makes of that, and Watson turns the question back around to Holmes. He's not going to fall for that trap again. And Holmes says it was obviously written on the train. The good writing represents stations. The bad writing is when the train is in motion. The worst writing is when the train is passing over the points, meaning the switch points where the train would switch tracks. So the train would kind of rock a bit at that point. And he says the only in the suburbs are there that many switch points. So if the entire trip was spent drafting the will, the train was an express, stopped only once when the handwriting got better in the middle, before it got to London. And Watson said, it's curious that such an important document will be drafted up in such a haphazard way, like jotting down on the train, which suggests to Holmes that Oldacre didn't, he wasn't putting a lot of stock in this document. And Watson said, yes, but he drew up his death warrant at the same time. So this is like driving Holmes crazy. And he races out the door, nearly stepping in a pile of horse poop in the road.
Did he? I missed that.
Yeah, no, he steps over it, but man, I was like, really? And he hails a cab and they go to Blackheath. We don't know why. But in Blackheath,
well, he does what I would have done when I was listening to McFarlane's story, which is check Oldacre's story against McFarlane's mother's story.
Yeah.
So he, according to Oldacre, he did it because, hey, I used to date your mother and we were almost married, but that didn't happen. Okay, I want to see what her version of the story is.
Yep. So in Blackheath, Mrs. McFarlane is still in mourning for her husband. So she's got the black veil in the back.
Yeah, so Victorian mourning was a whole thing.
It was, yes.
There was some change going on around this time. So there's a longer period and a shorter period. So go with the shorter period for widow's mourning. It was about 18 months. Uh, so, um, the first 15 months, you were supposed to wear crepe over your dress.
Mm-hmm.
The newer fashion in widow's mourning was to wear crepe just as a trimming, and to only do it for 6 to 8 months. And this particular excerpt from an 1888 book doesn't say shameless hussies, but it's sort of implied. Some few widows don't wear it at all during their mourning. And so once you've gone through the 18 months, you then go into half mourning.
Okay. Wow.
So the shorter period, you can do that after 15 months, and then you continue it for 3 months. And the period for wearing the widow's cap and veil is a year and a day.
Ugh.
And yeah, I mean, it just...
That's impressive.
Yeah, it goes on. Widowers, so men who have lost their wives, should wear mourning for 1 year, and they usually enter society after 3 months.
They do, because they got to find a replacement.
Yeah, of course. So there are rules for a parent, for a son or daughter.
Oh, wow.
For who you're mourning, for young children or infants, for a stepmother, for a sister-in-law, for a grandparent, aunt and uncle by marriage, great uncle, first cousin, second cousin, husband's relations, daughter-in-law, parents of a son or daughter-in-law, parents of a first wife.
Wow. Oh my God.
Victorians liked rules, and they really liked mourning. It probably became fashion, and this is a complete guess, because of Queen Victoria.
Yes.
She
Mourning
was
Albert.
Yeah, she mourned him. She wore mourning clothes for the rest of her life.
Yep. Which was long.
Yeah, she lived forever.
And she never came out of mourning.
Yeah, so it of course then became fashionable for everyone else to mourn as long as they could absolutely stand it.
Yeah, and there was that whole thing about taking the hair of the person you were mourning and weaving it like into brooches and stuff.
Yeah, hair jewelry. There's still some people who do that.
I mean, like that period of time, there was a big sort of death cult undercurrent.
Yeah. Again, probably stemming from
Victoria.
Yeah. Mourning Albert forever.
And I mean, from what I have read about Albert, he would have been annoyed at that.
Probably, yeah.
It was self-indulgent on her part.
Yes.
And she was constantly comparing her sons to him, and they never measured up. And
of course,
sounds like a nightmare. So when Holmes and Watson arrive, Mrs. McFarlane says, "My son is the gentlest creature on God's earth," and frankly, that's the impression he gave when he was talking to Holmes. He came off as a little naive, and
Yeah, he also looked like he was 14.
Yes, he had these big eyes and floppy blonde hair. She says he couldn't have even contemplated such a crime. He didn't even know the man. At which point, Holmes says, "But you did." And she looks distressed and lets them into the house. She says she'd almost forgotten that Oldacre had even existed, but he was truly impossible to forget. They'd been engaged. Thank heaven I had the sense to turn away from him and marry a better, if poorer man.
Yep. And that's when you're like, oh, I don't know exactly what happened. I'm pretty sure he was behind it.
Yep. Mr. McFarlane was a kind and gentle man, everything that Jonas Oldacre was not. And the more she knew of Oldacre, the less she really knew of him. She said there was a dark side to his character, a desire to cause pain. So he's something of a sadist.
Mm-hmm. And she pulls out a photo of her.
I love this scene.
Yeah, she said, "This was my first present to him." And they look at it and her face is scratched out.
And it's kind of burned a little bit too, around the edges. Yeah, and she says that's how Oldacre returned the photo to her on her wedding day, alongside a note cursing her and saying he'd never forgive her. So Watson, of course, representing all of us, is puzzled why Oldacre left the fortune to John Hector. And Mrs. McFarlane,
who coincidentally is now been arrested for his murder.
yes. Mm-hmm. And Mrs. McFarlane says, neither she nor John Hector want anything from that wicked man. But as Holmes says, the will was made. And he probes a bit. She'd never told John Hector about Oldacre. And she starts to kind of fob it off, but then confesses that her son found the photograph.
Why did she keep it?
Ah, I would have done the same thing. It's evidence.
Well, that's true.
There's a lot I've kept from destructive relationships that, I have a storage space, partly for a reason.
Fair.
Mr. McFarlane, her husband, tried to joke it off, but John Hector insisted on knowing, and his father told him, quote unquote, something of the truth. And Watson asks if the boy was disturbed. And she says he was naturally upset. And of course, Holmes tells her the police might say if he'd heard about Oldacre's cruelty towards his mother, they might think he had a motive. Mm-hmm. Which is part of.
He doesn't say keep your mouth shut.
No. But yeah, it's part. That's part of Oldacre's nefarious plan.
Yeah,
there's a motive.
Yep.
But she has faith that God will show that her son is innocent. So then Holmes and Watson go on to the crime scene, where Lestrade and his crew are wrapping up their investigation. We see a lot of Lestrade in this episode.
Yeah, we do.
Holmes hands over the draft of the will to Lestrade. It hasn't even been 24 hours. And Lestrade shows him trouser buttons they collected from the scene. And the buttons have the name Hyams on them, which is the name of Oldacre's tailor, he has discovered, according to the housekeeper. And the corpse, or what remains of it, is in the lab. It was little more than bone and cinder, says Lestrade, at which point Holmes says, oh, very convenient for the murderer. But he still doesn't know. He's perplexed at this point. He's really bothered. So Holmes is next examining the walking.
Well, and Watson says, thank heaven he was wearing his trousers.
Yes.
Of course he was wearing his. This was a timber yard. It wasn't an outhouse. Why would he have gone out there in his nightdress? What else would he have been wearing besides his trousers?
Boxers were not invented back then.
No.
So Holmes is examining the walking stick that McFarlane left behind with the bloodstains on it. And Holmes says he said he couldn't find it as he was leaving. And Lestrade points out the footprints of two men on the carpet, suggesting that McFarlane was in the room with the stick. And Holmes,
well, we also saw the housekeeper and the firefighter, the constable in the room later. So, they've also got fingerprints, footprints in that general area. Footprints will come back into this.
Well, and then
but not right here.
Holmes is like annoyed with Lestrade. He said too many other footprints are polluting the scene, so he can make nothing of that. Papers are spilling out.
Another trick for your side.
Yes. Oh yeah, and he's very much in competition with Lestrade.
Yeah,
it is hilarious. Papers are spilling out from the safe, so that confirms what McFarlane had told Holmes about the safe had been left open. And Lestrade says they've looked through one or two of them. Holmes asks if he can do the same. Lestrade leaves for Hudson Yard, sending in Mrs. Lexington, the housekeeper, at Holmes's request. So we get a good look at Mrs. Lexington, and she's also dressed in mourning, presumably for Oldacre.
And she says, no one will hear you if you scream in the night.
In the dark, in the night. Holmes asks her to sit down, and she says she'll stand, thank you. This room has no comfort for me.
Yeah, I have a note here. She looks like she's wearing mourning clothes. Do housekeepers generally mourn their employers so formally?
I have no idea, but given what we were talking about, the mourning fetish,
maybe,
probably.
Also, does this sort of imply that Mrs. Danvers and Oldacres were having an affair? Fanfic.
Yes, two devilish sorts.
Yes.
Holmes establishes that she let McFarlane in at 9:30 and went to bed at 11:30, and she heard nothing until
and she says, I wish my hand had withered before I had let him in.
Yes.
Holmes is like, cool, you went to bed at what time?
And she says she heard nothing till the fire alarm sounded, and it was only then that she realized Oldacre was murdered. Just like, how do you, like, there's a fire, you like, yeah. One doesn't necessarily follow from the other.
Right.
Holmes asks about enemies.
Yeah, he stands uncomfortably close to her while he asks this.
He clearly doesn't trust her as far as he can throw her.
Well, I mean, one look at her and you're like, oh.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is, but she's also involved in it too.
Right. And she says, every man has his enemies. He was a well-respected gentleman who kept to himself. Holmes asks if she knows anything about the papers, and she says no.
He knows nothing of his private affairs. I bet she knows of one private affair.
He asks about the buttons, and she confirms that he was wearing a suit made by Mr. Hyams that night.
Yeah, he had 3 trousers made by Hyams, 2 are still in the wardrobe, and the 3rd was what he was wearing, found in the fire.
So the way they did suits, and they still, if you're into haberdashery, they still do it like this. They make you like a bunch of trousers and one jacket. So you interchange your shirts every day. You wear your trousers, like, you rotate them, and you wear the jacket all the time. Saves
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Yep. Saves on dry cleaning. Which, yeah, they didn't have back then, but whatever.
Yeah.
So Holmes dismisses her, and Watson comments that she's...
Yeah, he dismisses her very dismissively. Like, all right, thanks, and flicks his fingers at her like,
go away.
That's all, yeah. So she scowls at him as she leaves.
Watson says she's as tight as wax. And I looked that up. And basically it means she's not giving up any secrets. And Holmes says that it's all wrong. I feel it in my bones. Something has not come out, and that woman knows it. So Watson offers to look through the papers. He says, a man's bank accounts can tell us as much as his diary. That is so true. I still have a bunch of my parents' old tax returns from the 1960s to go through to kind of get a sense as to how we were living when I was a little tiny kid. So, and I mean, this is the first thing I would have done forensically.
Yeah,
let's go through
follow the money.
Yeah. Holmes has no interest in any of this, and he goes outside and starts prowling around the crime scene as the police and the fire squads are packing up. And he pokes through the charred remains, goes back further.
Well, he finds something, and he's like standing on top of the rubble.
Yeah, he's on a board.
Yeah, he's standing very dramatically on top of the rubble.
And he goes back further, and he finds a set of stones in a circle around a larger stone, and then a set of sticks formed into a square. And this is, we kind of know this from the Dancing Men, hobo code.
Yeah.
He starts measuring angles near windows, and Mrs. Lexington's looking out at him extremely disapprovingly.
I don't understand why he's looking at angles and measuring.
Oh, I do. Okay. We'll get to that.
Okay.
And then he hails a cop, asks him if he's local, and they're chatting. We don't know what they're saying. And then Watson comes outside and says there are missing deeds in the pile of documents he's been reviewing. Plus, Oldacre was not actually wealthy. He'd been paying large sums to a Mr. Cornelius, and McFarlane would have inherited nothing. So Watson takes their cab back to Norwood Station to go to the city, to Oldacre's bank.
Yep, the days when you could walk into a bank, ask questions about someone else's account, and they'll tell you.
And Mrs. Lexington comes out of the house, and Holmes tells her he's found, quote unquote, an undesirable lurking by the gates. And she's like, what the hell do you mean by undesirable? And basically she says, a tramp. And she says, tramps will get nothing from the house. She's not kindly disposed to them. I work, so can they.
She believes in compassionate conservatism, which is not what it sounds like.
And she walks down the path with a basket. Presumably she's going into town to do some shopping. Then it's nighttime, and we see a tramp by a fire. He's combing his mustache and he's drinking. He's wearing a military jacket that's all raggedy. He's got bars on his sleeve. And we see Holmes is dressed like another tramp with soot all over his face, and he's at the same fire cooking a potato on a stick. And Holmes has got this accent that I cannot discern. I mean, it's a British accent, but I can't tell like what region it's supposed to be.
I feel like because he was pronouncing his words very precisely and kind of slowly, and I feel like between that and the vocabulary and his body language, he was trying to come off as somebody with some intellectual issues.
Right.
Intelligence issues.
Yes. What back then they would call simple.
Mm-hmm.
And also not of the upper class.
Yeah.
And he says, "Eyes on my way to Folkestone." And the tramp comments, "Well, he's done enough walking. He stays put." And Holmes says, "Eyes to meet a friend of mine here. You might know him. He's a seafaring man." And the tramp says, "I know him. Shared my billet for the last 4 nights he does. And off he goes without even a word." And the tramp tells Holmes to stay clear of this guy because he's a liar. The man, this seafaring man, went up to that big house and comes back and says they're giving out food and cast-offs. And then that the man went back the next day and never came back. So Holmes asks how that's a lie. And the tramp says, well, he tried it and they nearly called the cops.
For his insolence.
Yes. And he has trouble saying insolence because he's been drinking. So back at 221B, the street's really being dug up outside. It is absolute chaos there.
Well, Holmes, before the scene ends, says, well, maybe you told him a pleasing tale. And the man says, are you saying that a drunken sailor has more to offer than a sergeant in the 22nd? So there were pensioner institutions to care for aged veterans. There was pensioners at the Royal Hospital Chelsea for army soldiers. There was the Royal Hospital for seamen at Greenwich. But most military pensioners weren't given that level of care. In the 19th century, most of the battles that England soldiers fought were in other countries. So returning soldiers were easily overlooked by the general population, especially if they were sick or wounded. They didn't fit the narrative of the brave hero of the British Empire.
Oh my God.
And remember, this is how we got Watson as a narrator.
Yes.
He couldn't, his pension wasn't enough. He didn't have any help and he needed a roommate. And given the number of veterans, because the sun never sets on the British Empire, which meant a lot of fighting, the government money for pensions could be stretched thin. And there were also class issues.
Yes.
Most soldiers were not of the upper classes. Obviously, the officers were, but the vast majority of soldiers were of the lower classes.
Yep.
Which meant that, the population didn't really consider them. This is a monarchy, and class is very important to the very idea of monarchy.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of similar here where officers, there's the ROTC program, which recruits at universities. And you get, you sign up with them and you have to serve, but you start as a second lieutenant and work your way up from there. And then there are the regular troops where the highest they can achieve is like some level of sergeant. Yep. So yeah, I mean, this tramp was what he's got 2 bars on his sleeve. So he's climbed the ranks almost as high as he can, given his background.
Yeah.
And that's as far as it goes. So these guys were kind of left to the wind.
Yeah, and it was hard for them to find work.
And I'm sure Holmes had some sympathy because of Watson to this situation.
Yeah, he does seem outraged at the murder. That that happens.
Yes. And okay, so Staten Island has a cultural center with a botanical garden called Snug Harbor. It used to be, back in the day, in the 1800s, called the Sailors and Soldiers Snug Harbor. And a snug is someone who has come in from the sea and is done, like retired.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a place where they would live and they would be funded and get help. The rest of the name is Sailors and Soldiers Snug Harbor for Aged and Decrepit. So yeah, it's these institutions did exist on both sides of the Atlantic, but not everybody.
There wasn't enough of them.
Yeah, exactly.
And the sergeant, the tramp, says that this drunken sailor said he'd share whatever he would get. He went back to the house and not a sight of him since. There's a close-up on the fire in case we didn't get what was going on.
I missed that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So back at 221B, absolute hell in the street as things are being dug up. Holmes is playing his violin and thinking, and he's in his nightshirt and his dressing gown.
Yeah, and it's very dissonant violin playing.
His hair is in disarray too.
Yeah.
He looks pretty terrible.
Yes.
And Watson comes into the room and tells him he has to eat. Holmes says he can't spare the energy to digest food. He's despairing that he can solve the case, and Scotland Yard will hang McFarlane and therefore win. So again, he's competing with.
Yeah. I feel like he's doing Lestrade an injustice here. Lestrade cares about convicting the right person.
Well, look, that's his job.
I mean, we don't know that just yet, because this is the episode where we meet him, but it's not Holmes's first time meeting him. Holmes knows him.
Yeah. And there's a telegram from Lestrade saying they got evidence that nails McFarlane and Holmes should abandon the case. And Holmes says Lestrade is essentially gloating. And Watson's like very tender at this point. And he pours them coffee and he says, let's have some breakfast. And then
he first picks up Holmes's discarded violin.
Yes.
He puts it away like, dude, it's a Stradivarius.
Like he's really taking care of him.
Yes.
And he says, let's have some breakfast then and go out to see what we can do. And Holmes says that he will need Watson's company and moral support. So we've not seen him this low.
Yeah.
Back at the Norwood estate, they meet up with Lestrade. He tells them he's going to show his proof that McFarlane is guilty. He shows them a coat tree where Mrs. Lexington would have left McFarlane's hat and stick. There's a bloody thumb mark on the wall by the coat tree. Lestrade has a card with McFarlane's thumbprint on it, compares it to the bloody one on the wall, and they're the same. Yeah,
Lestrade, Holmes, and Watson having been forensically trained in fingerprint identification.
Well, the magnifying glass comes out.
Sir Francis Galton published Fingerprints in 1892, which established the classification system for fingerprints. In 1901, Scotland Yard established its first fingerprint bureau.
Ah, cool. So yeah, it was a new science.
Yeah.
Back then. So Lestrade tells him Mrs. Lexington is the one who found the thumbprint. And Holmes says there was no doubt that the mark was there yesterday then. And Lestrade says McFarlane couldn't very well have crept out of jail in the middle of the night to put it there.
To strengthen the evidence against himself.
Yes.
And Holmes is like,
Holmes asks if they can go upstairs. Mrs. Lexington watches both him and Watson, looking a little worried as they go up. And Holmes is prowling around. He goes up to the third floor where there's a room with old furniture.
Yeah, all of these rooms, everything above the ground floor seems surprisingly empty.
Well, I had a question at this point. Is it the set building that's terrible? Or is it the builder who's terrible?
Well, it's not the building itself looks nice, but there's no decoration.
Well, and the floors look unfinished.
Yeah, there's no furniture.
There's bare planks with no stain on them.
Is this house still in progress?
Well, yeah, and it was hard for me to believe the whole place wouldn't have gone up in flames, just because of all that unfinished wood.
Who
Holmes,
alerted the fire people? Maybe they were alerted very quickly.
yeah, that we never know.
Yeah.
So Holmes says to Watson, the thumbprint was not there in the hall yesterday. He knows because he checked. He runs downstairs to tell Lestrade his evidence is incomplete. There's a witness he hasn't seen. Lestrade tells him to go get him. Holmes asks about the cops that Lestrade has with him. Are they large men with powerful voices?
Lestrade's like, yeah, I guess. Yeah.
And Holmes says he wants 2 bundles of straw brought to the top landing along with 2 buckets of water.
He says, in the outhouse, there is a quantity of straw. He wants it brought inside.
No, I think the outhouse meant like a barn or shed. There are multiple meanings to the word outhouse.
I don't know. That straw looked pretty nasty.
It did, actually. Would have burned quickly, though. In the 3rd floor room, Holmes directs the cops to put the straw in front of the fireplace, the buckets on either side of it. He asks Watson to light the straw, the constable to sprinkle it with water, and the straw burns, and Holmes gets the cops to all yell, "Fire!" And
then the wall falls down.
Yeah, in the smoke, this it's like a window-sized panel that suddenly opens and a man climbs in, and it's Oldacre. They put out the fire. Lestrade is furious. His crew arrests Oldacre, and Holmes and Watson climb through the secret panel to
Yeah, Oldacre is like, I didn't do any harm, and Lestrade's like, you did your best to get an innocent man hanged. If it weren't for this gentleman standing before you, I'm not sure you wouldn't have succeeded.
He's so mad.
Yeah, I really like him in this.
I do too. So Holmes and Watson climb through this secret hole to a hiding place. And again, Oldacre's a builder. He could create this. So, and that's
with no Confederates except the housekeeper, Holmes says, who should also be arrested. Like, on what evidence? I don't like her and she's suspicious as fuck isn't evidence.
So that scene where Holmes is measuring angles and looking at windows, that's how he figures out there's a secret place. Because the windows and the walls are not lining up.
Okay. I assumed he had just done it when he was inside. He says that the rooms below, there's more space there than there is on the 3rd floor. But yeah, you're right. From the outside, everything would be equal.
And there's china and scraps of food on the plates. So that's why they arrest the housekeeper. She's in on it. Watson finds some papers on a table and he figures that they are the missing deeds. And Lestrade again asks Holmes how he knew about the secret room, and Holmes tells him the measurements of the house didn't add up. And
what we just said, basically.
Yeah, the wall by the fireplace was fake. By lighting a fire and sending smoke into the secret room, he scared Oldacre into coming out. Always
I had to do this in the most dramatic way possible.
And Lestrade asks about the thumbprint. And this is a part where I was confused because the scene they show is Oldacre putting his thumb. But really what should have happened is that Oldacre should have used the wax that McFarlane had sealed documents with.
Yes.
Dropped some blood in that and made the thumbprint out of that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's a continuity flaw.
Yeah, that's the result, I think, of fingerprints being very new.
And as for Mr. Cornelius, it's Oldacre himself. He's been squirreling away money from his main account so that McFarlane would actually get nothing and possibly hang in the process. And it's revenge for Mrs. McFarlane not marrying him. As for the body in the fire, it's the seaman, the other tramp. In the ashes, Holmes demonstrates he found the tooth of a great white shark with some carvings on it, which is typical of seamen at the time.
Yeah, it says Moby Dick.
Yeah, I mean, it's Scrimshaw, essentially. The seaman had stopped at the house, and contrary to what Mrs. Lexington told Holmes, he'd received some clothes of Oldacre's, hence the buttons. And the sticks and stones were the seaman's indication that there's hospitality at the house. The seafaring tramp wearing Oldacre's trousers returns to the house the next day. Presumably, he's bonked on the head with a walking stick and thrown into the fire that Oldacre set. And as Holmes and Watson leave, Holmes tells Lestrade to take the credit, which is very kind of him. Watson's like, it's the work. He loves the work.
Work is its own reward. Also, he'll set the record straight in one of his stories. So
yes. Story. Oldacre growls at Holmes that he'll see him hanged, but Holmes says the privilege must surely be mine. And the episode closes with John Hector playing piano for his mother while a maid is laying the table for tea. So peaceful.
Yes.
I want to know what happened to the money. You know, Oldacre's got this money and he's going to hang. Who gets it? Presumably the relatives he doesn't like very much.
Well, I mean, there is that new will that leaves everything to McFarlane. He probably inherits.
That's true, and it's a valid will.
Yeah.
Ooh. That's nice.
I really like that. That seems like true justice there.
Yeah. This had a lot to it.
Yeah, it did. I really like this one.
I do too. There's just the annotated actually doesn't have very much at all about it, which might be another reason I memory hold it.
Well, there's so many stories after a while.
This is true. Yeah, the engineer's thumb. That's one. I don't know if we'll get to that one.
Yeah, that one's worth missing.
Okay.
I don't know if it's that one or another one where Watson's married, but he comes back to Baker Street for whatever. And Holmes says, "Hey, I'm out on a case. Here's the case." And then he goes out, and then Watson takes a nap, and Holmes comes back and says, "Well, it's solved. Here's how it happened."
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this is Conan Doyle like really struggling for inspiration.
Yeah.
I want to know where Holmes got the potato that he was cooking in the fire with the tramp. Like, was he just carrying it?
Well, there might be a market nearby.
Yeah, I mean,
there's street sellers all over the place in Victorian times.
That's a good point. Yeah. This was wild. Any other thoughts that occur to you? Except now I must see Rosalie Crutchley and everything.
Yeah, I kind of want to watch The Haunting again. I don't think so. I mean, it just was a really fun story.
Yeah.
I liked the characterization of Lestrade, and I liked his interaction with Holmes.
Right.
And I like that he's, a decent guy who's doing his best.
Yes. Yeah, I like that too. He came across as likable while Holmes was competing unnecessarily with him.
Right.
I mean, it was all
completely unnecessarily, because he's like, "Oh yeah, you can take the credit, it's fine."
Oh, right. Yeah, for sure. I was struck by the level of effort to get revenge on a woman who had rejected you. It's not unusual.
Yeah.
But the amount of effort is, usually
I don't know.
Walking or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, you and I have talked about malignant narcissism for years, and that is something that malignant narcissists will do. They can never let go of a slight.
Yeah. Well, I sent you that article yesterday about the $400 million that Trump was going to get from Colombia, and they chose not to go that route, and so now he's billing them $400 million like decades later.
Yeah.
that exact amount. I mean, that kind of, and I go back to what my mother used to say: if you could understand crazy, I'd be worried about you. I mean, I just don't understand that
Yeah.
level of vindictiveness.
Yeah.
It's beyond me. But yeah, I mean, and the actor they got to play Oldacre really was a snarly kind of
Yeah, he was.
guy. And in Victorian times, there were these, it's like the way you looked was the way you were.
Hmm.
Not quite phrenology exactly,
Yeah,
but
but like everything had a uniform.
yes. And what was inside was reflected on the outside. So if you were ugly, that was your character probably was. Yeah.
Yeah, the story feels surprisingly modern, it's like
Mhm.
fingerprint thing.
Yes.
But also in kind of a depressing way, it feels surprisingly modern. Like,
Yeah,
yeah, there's,
it's still happening.
yeah.
Holmes hasn't stopped it from happening. Alrighty. So what's on tap next?
Okay, so this is all from us this week. If you've enjoyed the show and haven't subscribed yet, you can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to support us, you can leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Tell your friends. And join us next week when we'll be discussing The Resident Patient.
Another one I've memory hold. Cool.
Yeah, same.
All right. Talk with you then.
Bye.